We are in Brochos, page Gimel, side B, Gimel Amud Beis, and we have been learning about the Mishmaros, the watchings, and that got us into the fact that David HaMelech wakes up at midnight. And then, of course, we asked the contradiction because another place it says he wakes up at Neshef. So the Gemara had to go through a few explanations, 3 answers of how it wasn't a contradiction. Does he wake up at midnight or does he wake up at Neshef? And Neshef, we understood to mean the beginning of the night, although the Gemara does question that afterwards. And the Gemara came up with 3 answers of that he's always up at midnight, but he's not waking up at midnight because he's already up. Another answer was that before midnight he's dozing off a little, the light sleep and learning and sleeping. And after midnight he's miskaber ka'ari, he gets up strong like a lion. And then we had a 3rd answer that until midnight he was learning Torah, and after midnight he is singing praises to Hashem. And then after we mentioned these 3 answers, the Gemara discussed the word Neshef. Does it mean the beginning of night? Does it mean the morning? And we brought verses, and finally the Gemara concludes that there are 2 Neshefs. And you basically have to figure out from the context what the word Neshef means. Neshef literally means to jump and go up. And it either means the end of day and beginning of night, or the end of night and the beginning of day, that the night jumps away and day arrives, or the day jumps away and night arrives. And then the Gemara discussed the question of, did David HaMelech really know when midnight was? Because we know Moshe didn't know when midnight was. So the Gemara is trying to figure this out. How did David know if Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know? And I must say that it's very interesting because yesterday Ben, who I don't see him here, he asked, well, what about the fact that the dogs bark at midnight? So shouldn't everyone know when midnight is? All you got to do is listen outside and you'll hear the dogs barking. And it is interesting. I didn't see much commentary on this discussing it as to a full answer why both David and Moshe either didn't know when midnight was, or they needed some outside source to find out when midnight was, in addition to the fact that the Egyptians would not know when midnight was, because one of Moshe's big problems was that even if he knew when midnight is, the Egyptians don't necessarily know. They might not be correct when midnight is. And because of that, Moshe didn't want to tell them that it's going to happen at midnight because he's nervous that they will think that he's wrong, even though he's right, and for sure he's right. But if the fact that they're going to think he's wrong, he said, better, I shouldn't get involved in giving a definite time. Better if I just say that it's around midnight. So the question is, why did Moshe not know? Why did David not know? And why did the Egyptians not know when midnight is, if they could have all listened to the dogs barking? And I think that was a very good question. I don't see Ben. Edith, is Ben Is Ben here?
Rabbi Smith.
I'm discussing Ben's question, Edith. Oh, I can't hear you. Okay. Anyway,
Rabbi,
so, yes.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
The determination as to when or whether the dog barked, does that come from Yesias Mitzrayim, when all nature fell silent?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay, you remember when the Yidden were leaving Mitzrayim?
Uh-huh.
Okay, no dogs barked.
Correct.
No, the birds did not tweet. All nature was silent.
Uh-huh. I think you're mixing two stories. I think you're mixing two stories. One is the story of the revelation at Sinai, and the other is when the Jewish people left, when in Egypt, the night of the Exodus. So the night of the Exodus, it says the dogs didn't bark. You're right, and that's very interesting that you mentioned that. But the other part is, I believe, is connected to the revelation at Sinai. So the dogs didn't bark.
We have a niggin. It happened at midnight. It happened at Chatzot. Wasn't it at midnight that this happened?
Very interesting. I'm not familiar with that song. Is that a common song that you sing? In other words, I know the common songs of Shabbos Miros, but now I'm recognizing the words. Vayhi b'chatzi halayla, is that the song?
Yes, it's part of the repertoire at the end of the Seder.
Oh, interesting. Oh, so that's where I've seen it, maybe in the Haggadah. We don't sing we don't sing that. It's not a common song in my tradition. But you're right. Yes, I have seen that. Interesting. Vayhi b'chatzi halayla. Oh, I have to take a look in the Haggadah and check it out. The heading, I recognize the heading, and so it mentions all of that about the birds not chirping and all, and what you're saying. Are you sure it says it there?
I think it mentions other things, but the Exodus was at midnight, and so I think I learned, if not that song, other things happening in order to allow us to leave Egypt safely and not arouse anyone else. All nature was supposed to have fallen silent at that time.
Very interesting. I'm going to pull it up here on my phone. I have the Hebrew font. Let's see if it has the song here. Piyut. Yeah, this should be it. So it says, then many miracles on that night, the beginning of the night. Ger tzedek netzachtoi. Very poetic, I must say. Danta melech gra b'chalem halayla. Ifchadeto harami be'emesh halayla yisrael yashar b'kel v'yuchal zera b'chayrei pasros. It looks to me like it's not only what happened on that night. It talks about possibly it's a lot of things jumping back and forth. I don't have the English here, and these aren't the typical words. They're like poetic words. But let's see. Tisas yoatz macharif and neifef ivoy havashta b'karav b'layla. Yeah. I have to take a look in the Haggadah. So very interesting. We'll have to check it out. Any of you, maybe someone in the audience is familiar with that song and knows the translation of that song, and would like to share anything from that song. Anyone here?
I don't have it in front of me, Rabbi, but in the Ashkenaz tradition, most people say that at the end of the Haggadah, and it does list a whole bunch of things that happened on at Chatzos. And the part of the idea is that because Makas Bechoros and the beginning of the Exodus was at Chatzos, so it lists a whole bunch of things in Tanakh that also happen at Chatzos.
Right. Okay, that's what it seemed like. It seemed like it was talking about Ish Chamudais, Chatzos, and other. Yeah, it seemed like it was a few different events, different periods in history. But Jerry, nice that you bring it up. I'll have to take a look more, to be able to concentrate more on it and look through it. But the other point you mentioned is something we touched on yesterday, and really Ben brought it. I think Ben brought it up. It was about the idea of that the dogs did not bark, and that sort of is an interesting connection between our Gemara. We're trying to figure out, if the Egyptians would know about Chatzos, or Moshe would know when Chatzos is, or David HaMelech would know when Chatzos is, and that's what the Gemara is going through, these different ideas. And we have a fact that the dogs didn't bark that night of the Exodus. And Moshe himself is telling that to Pharaoh. So there is based on one of the conclusions of the Gemara, there is one of the commentaries of Yonis and Eibeshitz, and he connects it, and he says that the Egyptians didn't know when Chatzos is because it was midnight when the dogs didn't bark, and therefore Moshe was afraid to tell them that it's going to happen at midnight. And in fact, what comes out is that it's like the opposite. They're going to prove from the fact that the dogs didn't bark that maybe you could even go a little further and say you could prove from the fact that they didn't bark that they're going to tell Moshe, you're wrong. It wasn't midnight when it happened. I don't know if he goes that far. He just says that the fact that the dogs didn't bark, so they wouldn't be able to prove. He wouldn't be able to prove that it's at midnight because there was a special miracle that happened that night that the dogs didn't bark at midnight. I gave an answer yesterday, and I think there might be some validity to it. I mentioned yesterday also that possibly the dogs barking didn't take effect. These mishmaros symbols didn't really take full effect until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, maybe, and therefore we're not even dealing with the fact that why don't they mix into our Gemara what we had on the previous page about the dogs barking? It's not even mentioned here about the dogs barking, even though the previous page just mentioned it. Maybe because before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, it didn't affect the animals in that way that they would express this what's going on in heaven, where Hashem is crying over the destruction. So it's just a thought. I don't know. I don't have a source, but just to answer the question, it seems like maybe there is such a possibility. Okay, so let's read the Gemara inside from the David, where I know we did it yesterday, but I just want to go over it and get
Rabbi.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you a question. Why do dogs have to bark at midnight? Suppose they bark at 1 o'clock or bark at 11 o'clock. Why have to bark at midnight exactly? Why?
Why do they bark at midnight? So that the Gemara said it. We learned it on the previous page that there are 3 mishmaros in the night, and there are symbols here on earth when those watchings happen in heaven. And one of the symbols was that the dogs bark. And one of the opinions in the Gemara was that it's the middle of the middle watching, which ended up being at midnight. And which according to that opinion of 3, if there are 3 in the night, in the middle of the middle one, it comes out that that's at midnight. So the dogs bark at midnight. So the question is, why do they bark at midnight? So the simple reason is because this is something going on in heaven at that time. It's some auspicious time, and somehow the dogs are able to express this with their barking. There is Kabbalistic ideas from Reb Tzadok HaKohen that somehow the midnight is the exact beginning of daytime, which symbolizes the time of Mashiach. And so he says because the day midnight is when the end of the we're sort of getting ready for the morning. It's the second half of the night, so we're slowly getting ready for the time of Mashiach. We've passed midpoint, so to speak, and he does bring some interesting things, that the dog is connected to. It has an element of impurity to it, but it also has an element of holiness to it. And it's based on the fact that there's something called Perek Shira, where all the animals sing praises to Hashem, and the dog sings one of the greatest praises, Bayu nishtachve v'nechra lifnei Hashem oisenu. So he says a beautiful praise to Hashem. Let's go and bow before Hashem, our maker, our creator. So somehow the dog has some spiritual elements to it. I mean, there's more to it than that. I mean, I was looking a little into the uniqueness of the spiritual elements of the dog, and there are a number of things that they say. A dog is, they say, Kelev is Kili B'nai Yisrael. To me, is the B'nai, to me is the B'nai Yisrael. Somehow the Jewish people somehow are connected. So there's also I believe the dog is Gematria Eliyahu, and the dogs also revealed the dead bodies of the Egyptians when after the smiting of the firstborns. So the Egyptians tried to hide the dead bodies because they didn't want Moshe to be able to say, "See, I was right." And they didn't, so they hid the bodies, and the dogs went and pulled out those bodies. So they didn't bark when we left, or they didn't bark, at midnight. Instead they went and pulled out the bodies to reveal Hashem's miracle. They sing a great praise to Hashem. They are Gematria Eliyahu. They actually, it says, there's another Talmudic statement where it says that the dogs are joyous when Eliyahu is in town. So all of these things, it seems like there's some spiritual element to the dog. So he says that's why the dogs sing at midnight. It's some connected to the side of holiness of them, and that's and that's the symbol of that Mashiach is on his way. Did everyone? Yeah. Sound interesting? Anyway, so
I don't get the beat, but all right.
Now, along the same, once we're on the topic, we now spoke about the dogs twice. I'll just mention one more thing, that there is Talmudic statements that are against having dogs. And for example, there definitely used to be dogs that, or it was common for dogs to bite and be considered a dangerous animal, and there is statements in Jewish law about how it's prohibited to own a dog because they, if they're evil, if they bite, if they're, if they could cause harm, and so it's and there's a curse that one of the Talmudic statements says a curse goes on someone, with a dog. But generally that refers to a dog that bites, or at least that barks and scares people. There are statements that say that a dog that scares people, if someone's pregnant, they could miscarry if they get frightened from a dog. So there are some, there are different, it's interesting. So I'm saying all the positive things. Don't go out now and go buy dogs. I am also mentioning, there are some negative things as well. I personally do not own a dog. So
Rabbi Smith?
Yes.
Didn't David HaMelech have dogs?
And how do we know that?
I think there's some reference to it, and I'm not exact. I don't exactly remember the exact spot, but
maybe you'll look it up online after the class, Manny, and you get back to us on Monday if you find any. All right, that would be great to look into. I'd like to find out if that's true, because that would be a clue to this. I wanted to answer maybe another answer to what I was mentioning earlier, that why didn't David use the dogs to, it would have been a good sign for him to use. And I was thinking maybe because the dogs didn't exist in the community because of the curse that was on the dogs, or because, that people shouldn't have dogs. So David HaMelech was in Israel. He was in a community that was solely Jewish. Maybe they didn't have dogs there. Another thought that came to my mind is that maybe the dogs that bark at midnight are only the wild dogs. And if that's true, then even the people that have dogs, because they're not the wild dogs, maybe that's why we did not, they wouldn't wake up or know when midnight is, because the wild dogs were not popular in Jewish communities, because people it was definitely prohibited to own a wild dog. Any dog that would bite, I guess, is considered or frighten people. So maybe that's why they didn't use. I'm just trying to throw together some thoughts of why we weren't using these, why they didn't use the dogs to know when midnight is. Yes.
Just one other thought, that the possible reason why the dogs did not bark at midnight during the Yitzias is because Hashem himself came to take the firstborn, and it would not be appropriate for the watches to sing praises to Hashem. So therefore, there was no reason for a dog to bark, since there was no beginning watch that night.
So you're saying because Hashem was down here that night, there were no angels praising him? Is that what you're saying?
The Egyptians were passing away. The same reason why we do have Hallel on the last 6 days of Pesach.
Or you mean on the seventh day?
On that night, Egyptians were dying because Hashem was here passing judgment.
So, well, that's a very interesting thought, very innovative. I think that's very interesting that the angels didn't say praise that night because of the Egyptians dying. Very interesting, and yeah, it's definitely something to look into. Okay, thank you, Manny. Very nice. So we are going to continue now inside. Again, we're going to start from V'David, about 12 lines up from the bottom of the page. V'David, and David, mi hava yada palgo delelya. Did David know when midnight was? He says, I would be up at midnight, or I would wake up at midnight. Did he know midnight? V'David, mi hava yada palgo delelya emas. Did he know emas, when it was, when midnight was? Hashta Moshe Rabbeinu le hava yada. Now Moshe didn't know. D'chsiv, as it says, kachatzos halayla ani yotze b'seich Mitzrayim. Like at midnight, I am going to go out through Egypt. And he says, like at midnight. What does it mean, like my kachatzos? What does it mean, like at midnight? Ilema, if you will say, the Amar le kutshav richu kachatzos, that Hashem told him kachatzos, like at midnight. Mi ika sveka kamishmaya, is there a question in front of heaven, meaning before Hashem? Does Hashem not know when midnight is? And it's quite, he gives a like around midnight, like he doesn't know exactly. Ella, rather, the Amar le, that Hashem told him, it must be that Hashem told Moshe bachatzos, the asa ihu b'amar kachatzos, and he came and he said kachatzos. Now, if you're using the Hebrew text, there were two parentheses. I should tell you that the common custom in the Gemara is, if there are brackets inside the words of the Gemara, you read them. If there are parentheses, you skip them. It means that it's somehow the common tradition is that the parentheses were placed when there was a word that didn't seem to fit or somehow was mistakenly put in. And so they put parentheses. They don't want to remove the word. They just put parentheses around it. But brackets means that it's meant that it should be learned and studied. So that's why I skipped those two parentheses there. Now, Moshe told the Egyptians kachatzos. The Gemara is saying, but Hashem didn't know. So the Gemara says, no. Hashem told Moshe bachatzos with a base at chatzos, exactly at chatzos. V'yasa ihu, when he went and he came, v'amar, and he said kachatzos, at like chatzos, at around chatzos, with a chaf. Alma, we see mesafkale. He was unclear. He wasn't sure. The David Havayada, and David knew when Chatzos was. So if Moshe didn't know, how would David have known? That's a question mark goes there. How would David have known? And the Gemara answers, David Simna Havale. David had a siman. He had a sign. The Amar Rav Acha, because Rav Acha Bar Bizna says, Amar Reb Shimon Chasida, in the name of Reb Shimon Chasida, Kinor Hayatoloi Lamaila, there was a kinor, which is a harp that was hanging above Mimitase Shal David, of the bed of King David, Vekivan Shehigia Chatzos Laila, and once midnight arrived, Ba Ruach Tzefinus, the northern wind came, V'naisheves by Umanagin Me'elav, it would blow in it, and it would automatically produce sound on its own. And somehow the way it worked, Rashi tells us that there are 6 hours that each wind has its power. So the northern wind we see here is Ruach Tzefinus, the northern wind. It blows from midnight to dawn, and the eastern wind is the first 6 hours of the day until noon, and then the southern wind is the last 6 hours of the day, and the beginning of the night is the western wind. So at midnight starts the northern wind. And Tosfos tells us that the northern wind blows with all the other winds. But the Gemara here is telling us that the northern wind would blow at midnight. It means alone, separately. It wouldn't blow together with the other winds. It had its own blowing time that it blew. Even though it would blow with the others, it would only blow, it would blow alone at midnight. So the question is, so it would blow, and this would immediately, David would awaken and be Isaac in Torah and study Torah until dawn. Now the question is, if the northern wind, if Tosfos is what Tosfos is saying is that the northern wind blew all the time, so it would seem like the harp was humming all the time. In other words, if you want to say that the northern wind only rang at midnight, then it would seem very obvious to be able to tell when midnight is, because the harp would start playing. But if the northern wind was blowing all night, all day and all night, so then how did David know when midnight was? So you either have to say that the amount of the sound of midnight was obviously much more, or you could maybe say that it had some type of a system where it was like it was attached to something that would slowly lower itself, and it would arrive at some point at midnight to be just ready to receive that northern wind. So that, that's a possibility, but somehow the northern wind was the way he would tell when midnight is. So the Gemara says that when we have this statement from a from another, from another sort, from another Gemara, that he had this kinor above his bed, and it would blow, and he would get up and be Isaac and Torah, and we're now 6 lines up from the bottom of the page, Ad Sha'ala Amar HaShachar, until the morning star would rise. Kivan Sha'ala Amar HaShachar, once the morning star rose, Nichnasu Chachmei Yisrael Etzloi. The wise ones of the Yidden would come and enter, and the reason why they would enter, this didn't happen every day. The Ritva mentions, one of the commentaries mentions that this is not a daily occurrence, but it happened every so often. That at dawn, the wise ones of the Yidden would come, the Chachamim, and they would tell him, Amru lo Adonenu HaMelech, our master, the king, Amcha Yisrael Trichen Parnasa, the nation, your nation, Klal Yisrael, needs sustenance. Amar Lahem, and he would tell them, Lechu, go out, V'hisparnasu zemizeh, go do business with each other. Amru Loi, and they told him, Ein HaKoimetz Masbia Esoari. A koimetz will not satisfy a lion. Now, a koimetz either means a handful, or there is another translation of a koimetz to mean a grasshopper. Chagov in Aramaic is a koimetz, a kamtza. So maybe there are other translations, but basically it's a small amount can't satisfy a lion. And so how are the Yidden going to have enough parnasa from the small amount of business that will be done with each other? Not going to be enough. And the pit will not be filled from its chulya, from its sand, and from its what was dug up. From what was dug up, it won't be filled. Rashi explains that this means that if you have a pit and you dig more, you won't be able to fill up the pit from the stuff you're digging now, because you already have a pit in the first place. And so digging more is not going to help the problem. You need to bring earth from an outside source to be able to fill the pit. Tosfos says that he doesn't understand Rashi. He had a different explanation of Rashi. His explanation of Rashi was that if you dig a pit and you put the earth down on the ground, you'll never have enough earth to refill the pit that you dug. And the reason, I think, is because the earth, it falls into the ground wherever you place the earth, and therefore it's absorbed into the other earth, and that there's never enough afterwards to really fill it fully. And Tosfos doesn't like that explanation. He says, because here we're not talking about to take from the poor and to give it back to them. We're talking about taking from the rich and giving it to the poor. So if you would dig a pit and give it back to them, that would be like taking from the poor and giving it back to the poor. So Tosfos says it doesn't seem to flow. Therefore, Tosfos says that it means that if you have a pit that's filled with water, or that has water, it won't be, or a pit made for water, it won't get filled from its own, from on its own. You need to bring water from an outside source. And what I think Tosfos means is that if you have some type of a pit for water, or some type of reservoir, so it'll have a small hole on the top for you to lower a vessel into it to pull up water. Now, if the rain falls into that rains, that rainwater is never going to fill up that pit because that vat of water, because you only have a small hole on the top. In order to fill it up, you gotta bring from the sides. You gotta somehow open up the sides, bring water from outside from other wells. You attach a pipe on the bottom to bring water from another well, but the water is not going to fill from that hole on the top. But I'm not 100% sure if that's what Taisus means. That's what it seems like he means. And anyway, the point is, I guess the idea is that they told David HaMelech it's not going to be possible to support support all the economic issues that we have. So anyway, so the Gemara, David HaMelech here tells them back, Amar Lahem, L'chu peshtu yedechem b'gdud, go and spread out your arms with the army, and let's go fight the Amalek nation. And because at that point, they still had nations that were in Eretz Yisrael, and they wanted to get rid of them. So they were like, let's get rid of the other nations and destroy them once and for all. So they would miyad yetzem Achitophel, then they would ask advice from Achitophel, and nimnachem b'Sanhedrin, ask a check with the Sanhedrin, v'shaylam b'urim v'tumim, and ask the Urim v'tumim, which we said was basically the Kohen Gadol who wore the Urim v'tumim. Amar Rabbi Yosef. Now Rabbi Yosef says, Mikra. What is the verse for this? So it says, V'acharei Achitophel b'Nayahu ben Yehoyada ve'Avyasar v'Sar Tzava l'Melech Yoav. So you have Achitophel b'Nayahu ben Yehoyada, two people. Avyasar, the third person is Avyasar, who's a Kohen Gadol, and Sar Tzava l'Melech, the chief officer of the king, which is Yoav. So then the Gemara says, what are these specific individuals' jobs? So it says Achitophel zeyoyitz. Achitophel was the advisor. And so it says Achitophel asher yatz, the advice of Achitophel, that he gave advice by Yom Haim Kasher Yishal b'dvar ha'elokim. As someone would ask Hashem, that's how perfect his advice was. Benayahu ben Yehoyada. We're now turned the page to page 4. Benayahu, the son of Yehoyada, Zeh Sanhedrin. This is Sanhedrin, that he was the head of the Sanhedrin, and they would. I mentioned yesterday that Rashi says that they would check with the Sanhedrin in order that the Sanhedrin would daven for them. And I mentioned that's an interesting reason to check with the Sanhedrin. You would think the Sanhedrin was they checked into in order to get permission from the Sanhedrin to give permission for a war or give halachic advice. But here Rashi tells us it's in order for them to daven for the army, which is sounds like a Hasidic idea. You get a bracha from a rebbe or something. But Rashi says that in order that they should daven for them. Anyway, so then they have the next statement is of Avyasar. And Avyasar, what was Avyasar? Avyasar was the Kohen Gadol, Elu Urim v'Tumim. This is because they were going to ask the Urim v'Tumim, and that was Avyasar was the one who wore the Urim v'Tumim, and Avyasar at that time was the Kohen Gadol. And then it says, V'chein ho'aymer u'v'nayo ben Yehoyada ala kreisi v'ala plesi. That Benayo ben Yehoyada was before the kreisi and plesi. So what that means is that first they would ask the head of the Sanhedrin, and only afterwards they would ask the kreisi and plesi.
Good, huh?
And the Gemara says, why is it called the kreisi and plesi? V'lama nikra shmam kreisi and plesi. And the Gemara says, it answers, kreisi shekarsin divrayim. Kreisi means that its words were precise. And plesi shemufloim divrayim, that the words were wondrous. on the side, there's another girsa, another version that the Gemara says, why is it called Urim v'Tumim? And it says Urim means from the word Me'irim es Divreihem, and that the words would shine, and meaning that it would seem perfect. And Tumim shemashlimin es Divreihem, its words were complete. And anyway, that's the reason why it's either called Krasi and Plasi or it's called the Urim B'Tumim. And then it says V'achar kach sar tzava melech yoyov. The commander in chief of the army for the king was Yoav to bring the people of war, to bring the soldiers and start a war, and then this way they would conquer more area and be able to supply everyone with enough sustenance.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So were you just saying that the Sanhedrin could be called either the Krasi and Plasi
No.
or the Urim V'Tumim?
That's what it looks like. What the verse that we brought from Benayahu about Benayahu ben Yehoyada, Al HaKrasi v'Plasi, is to show that first they would ask the Sanhedrin, and only afterwards it would be Krasi and Plasi. And so the way to read the verse is Al HaKrasi v'Plasi, means before, on top of the Krasi and Plasi means, which means before it. That's the way.
I thought the understanding was Al in this sense that Benayahu ben Yehoyada was Al HaKrasi, that he was leading the Krasi and Plasi. He was the head of the Sanhedrin.
So no, no, that's not what it means. No, if you look in Rashi, Rashi says Rishon v'koidem lahem. Benayahu was before, first and before the Krasi and Plasi, before them. Shebatchila naitlem rishus. First, they would take permission, and from the Sanhedrin. And afterwards, they would ask the Urim V'Tumim, or the Krasi and Plasi, if they will be successful. So that's the purpose of that verse, is to show that it was before.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions? Because yes, Manny? I can't hear you. I don't know why. Is it just me? Oh, I can't hear anyone. 1 second.
He has to unmute himself.
No, but I think he's Manny. Oh, try again. Yeah. Now let's hear. No, we can't make it out.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jerry. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's open up our Tanyas.
Smith.
Yes.
I meant to add one thing about the dogs briefly. Going out of Egypt, and the fact that they did not bark, Hashem gave them a reward. The reward is supposed to be that they're allowed treifa meat.
That's right. That's right. Very interesting.
They're allowed to eat treifa meat. They still have to abide by the issue of basar v'cholav, but they can have treifa meat.
Right. I mean, I think that what that means is we're not supposed to feed them basar v'cholav. I don't know if there's a prohibition on the dogs to eat basar v'cholav, but right, a Jew is not supposed to benefit from milk and meat, and therefore we can't feed them milk and meat. But it does say that la kelev tashlichon isai, that a dog you can throw ubasar basada treifa loisechelu la kelev tashlichon isai. If an animal was ripped apart in the field, you throw it to a dog to eat. there is a second thing that the dogs were given as a gift, and that is that parchment is worked on by, believe it or not, by the excrement of the dogs in order to loosen the parchment. So supposedly all the tefillin and the sefer Torahs and mezuzahs are all made with using a dog. You need a dog in order to make the tefillin. Which is very interesting. And as I mentioned, Tili B'nai Yisrael. Anyway, I don't own a dog, and I don't plan on owning a dog. So that's a side note. So